Welcome, everyone. I'm Kara Stein. I'm the Vice President of Policy and Program at the American Constitution Society. We're the country's foremost progressive legal network with more than 200 student and lawyer chapters across the nation. And ACS is celebrating its 20th year of shaping legal debate, nurturing the next generation of lawyers, judges, and advocates, and ensuring that the law is a force to improve the lives of all people. We're focusing our work in this anniversary year on our Constitution's founding failures when it comes to race and equality in this country, and reckoning with our past to create a more just future. If you don't already, we encourage you to follow us on social media, including on Twitter at ACS Law. And you can also find us online at acslaw.org. And there you can join ACS and find more information about upcoming events and opportunities, including our virtual national convention, which begins June 7th. Today's program, Founding Failures, How America's Racial Caste System Has Limited Opportunities for People of Color, coincides with another anniversary, though a far less celebratory one. This Monday will mark 100 years since the Tulsa Race Massacre. For those who are unfamiliar, from May 31st to June 1st, 1921, an armed white mob descended upon the neighborhood of Greenwood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, a prosperous and vibrant neighborhood that came to be known as Black Wall Street, killing hundreds of Black people and destroying the property and businesses that were the heart of the community. As our nation continues to reckon with racial inequality, the many ways in which communities of color have been denied the so-called American dream loom large. Our nation's wealth was built on land stolen from Indian tribes and labor stolen from enslaved people, and for centuries, our laws and policies have been crafted to allow for the hoarding of wealth, resulting in a massive racial wealth gap. Today's panel will look at that history and will also look ahead to what might be done to redress these wrongs. I'd now like to turn it over to my colleague, Lindsay Langholtz, an ACS Director of Policy and Program, who will lead today's discussion with our distinguished speakers. Lindsay, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Kara. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. This call is being recorded, and the recording will be available on ACS's website at www.acslaw.org. We'll be taking questions after our presenters have finished with their opening remarks. If you'd like to ask a question, you can type it into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen at any time during the call. Make sure you're using that Q&A box or else it might get lost. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible. Finally, 1 hour of California CLE credit is available for this call. Please email us with racial wealth gap in the subject line at info@acslaw.org to receive your certificate. If you are seeking CLE credit in a jurisdiction other than California, please consult the rules of that state's CLE board to see if it provides for reciprocity with California. CLE materials can be found on the event page of the ACS website and will be shared with all participants in a follow-up email. With so much to cover, I want to dive right in. Let me quickly introduce our panelists in the order in which they will speak. Dr. Laura Sullivan is the Director of Economic Justice at the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. She has co-authored and led the quantitative analysis of national survey data for a number of publications and policy briefs. Most recently, she was a Senior Research Associate at the Institute on Assets and Social Policy at Brandeis University. Her work exposing the trends and drivers of the racial wealth gap has been covered by major media outlets. She has a Master of Public Affairs from the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin, and a PhD in social policy from the Heller School for Social Policy and Management at Brandeis University. Next, we'll hear from Professor Narinda Hyatt. She is the Director of the Civil Justice Clinic and Associate Clinical Professor of Law at Rutgers Law School. Prior to joining academia, she worked as a trial attorney in the U.S. Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division, Housing and Civil Enforcement Section. While in the Civil Rights Division, Professor Hyatt led a case that resulted in the DOJ's first combined police practices and fair housing settlement. Before her time with the DOJ, she was in private practice, specializing in white-collar, insurance, and civil rights litigation. She earned her BA from Dartmouth College and her JD from the University of Virginia School of Law. And finally, last but not least, we'll hear from Professor Vinay Harpalani, who is an associate professor of law at the University of New Mexico Law School. There, he teaches courses in constitutional law, civil rights, civil procedure, and employment discrimination. His scholarship focuses on the intersections between race, education, and law, as he explores the nuances of racial diversity and identity from various disciplinary perspectives. His written work has appeared in numerous publications in Law Journal, several of which have been cited in legal briefs or opinions at the U.S. Supreme Court, U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit, and the New York Court of Appeals. We could spend the rest of our time on his degrees that he's earned, but quickly he has earned BAs from the University of Delaware, masters from, and a PhD in education from the University of Pennsylvania, and his JD is from NYU Law. So with that, Dr. Sullivan, I'd love to turn to you first to help us set the table and really dig into what is the racial wealth gap and what drives it.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. Thank you for the invitation. I'm pleased to be able to talk about these important issues with the group today. So I'll be really setting the stage with my presentation, talking about the racial wealth gap, where we are, how we got here, and what we can do to combat the racial wealth gap moving forward. So first, just a little bit of background on the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. For those of you who are not familiar with our institute, the institute seeks to empower people of color by building reparative systems that create wealth, transform justice, and harness democratic power from the ground up in New Jersey. And that mission statement really highlights our three broad areas of work, which include economic justice, criminal justice reform, and democracy and justice. And despite those being three areas that we work in, we see them as intersecting and overlapping because we think they're all really crucial for promoting racial and social justice in New Jersey and the country more broadly. We are committed to exposing and repairing the cracks of structural racism in our foundation that erupt into earthquakes in communities of color. So our work really seeks to identify where those inequities were built into our social and political systems, and then repairing those harms, which we know have been really exacerbated in the current moment in the pandemic. So first, just where are we now? Here is the most recent data we have on the racial wealth gap here in the United States. This is from the Federal Reserve Survey of Consumer Finances, and you can see that the wealth gap in this country is enormous, and it's actually much higher than income inequality. So for a long time, when we were looking at economic security, folks were only looking at income disparities, but we know that wealth disparities, in particular, wealth disparities by race and ethnicity, are really crucial for understanding economic inequality and racial inequality. So as the data in the slides reveal, the median Black family has about $24,000 in wealth compared to about $36,000 for the typical Latino family, and over almost $190,000 for your median white family in the country. And so those ratios for wealth inequality are much greater than income inequality, which, as the slide suggests, is just 61 and 74% for income inequality compared to 13 and 19% at the median ratio for wealth inequality. So we really think wealth inequality is crucial for understanding racial inequality, because wealth provides long-term security that helps people in a moment of crisis, in a moment of income volatility, that rainy day fund that is so crucial for security, as well as investments in mobility, whether it's education or housing. Wealth really provides that long-term security that is so crucial for stability and economic security. Homeownership is a major contributor to the racial wealth gap, and so I'll be talking more about some of the policies that led us to where we are today. Wealth inequality in New Jersey is actually higher than it is in the state more broadly. The median wealth and the most recent numbers we have available are about $352,000 for the median white family, compared to less than $10,000 for Black and Latino families. And that's in large part due to the fact that white median wealth in New Jersey is so high, and that we have extremely high home values in this state that are not being equally shared because of unequal access to home ownership. So home ownership is key to understanding the racial wealth gap for two reasons: both access to home ownership, which is what the graphic here describes. Black and Latino families are much less likely to be homeowners due to a number of barriers that I'll highlight in a few slides, as well as home values in communities of color tend to be lower. So even when families of color are able to access home home values are lower because of the structural inequalities that we have built into our neighborhoods, from segregation in schools to underinvestment in place-based resources. Families of color do not see the same home equity gains that white families do in predominantly white neighborhoods. And we know that access to generational wealth helps open up access to home ownership. So when previous policies that helped white families build wealth help current white families support their children in accessing home ownership. So without reparative policies, we see those trends in inequality continuing and actually being exacerbated. So how did we get here? In our recent report, Erasing New Jersey's Red Lines, we talk about a number of the policies that led us to where we are today in terms of the racial wealth gap. A number of them that we highlight in our report are listed here, from really the founding of our nation with slavery and barriers to home ownership by race. In the 20th century, we saw redlining, limiting where Black families and other families of color could purchase their homes, racially restrictive covenants as well, limited home ownership for Black families, inequality in the GI Bill, expanded the middle class, but primarily for white people, educational inequities from school segregation to our current student loan crisis have been important for creating the wealth inequities that we see today. Predatory lending that targeted families of color during the Great Recession also led to major declines in wealth for families of color, exacerbating the existing racial wealth gap. And then the pandemic has led us, as I noted at the beginning of this conversation, to even more evidence that our inequities are being exacerbated. So I will talk about just a few of these to highlight some of the policy examples. There's a long history of how policies have led us to the racial wealth gap, but I'll highlight just a few to really highlight where policy shaped the racial inequities that we see today. So redlining, more specifically, to give a little more detail, the map on the previous page was a redlining map. Those are available for every neighborhood that had a redlining map online today. The graphic on this slide is actually a homeowner's loan corporation assessment of a particular neighborhood in New Jersey. And those assessments were designed to assess lending risk in a community. However, they were explicitly racist and often led to a self-fulfilling prophecy in which neighborhoods were identified as higher lending risk, and then lending opportunities dried up in Black communities and other communities of color. Redlining then limited financial opportunities for investment and led to neighborhood decline and underinvestment, and we see the ongoing health and financial consequences. The NCRC, the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, recently put out a report showing the ongoing health effects in redlined communities. More recently, I just wanted to highlight that redlining and lack of lending and discrimination in lending from private lenders continues to this day. The Hudson Savings Bank in 2015 had to go into a settlement with the CFPB because of their lack of lending in communities of color in New Jersey and other neighboring states. You can see from the slide that just 25 out of almost 2,000 loans in 2014 were to Black borrowers. I noted that the GI Bill is a major source of wealth inequality that continues to this day. As noted, the GI Bill really helped expand the middle class for white families, but the policy was designed in a way that it was administered at the local level and allowed for discrimination and implementation. And that happened all over the country. It happened in the South, but it also happened in the North in our own state of New Jersey. We have evidence that in New Jersey and northern New Jersey and New York, of about 67,000 mortgages that were available through the GI Bill. Just 100 non-white veterans received those loans. So while on the face they were supposed to benefit all veterans, they really did not. Our recent work around student loans has really highlighted how the student loan crisis is really affecting and exacerbating the racial wealth gap. And underfunding and defunding of higher education, particularly at the state level, has had greater impacts on families and students of color, particularly Black students. So here in New Jersey, we put out a report recently entitled Freed from Debt, focusing on how we can help students and help Black students in particular have a debt-free future. And so we think that it's really important to address this crisis and see how we can help students not face the current debt crisis they are facing. We know that the debt crisis has been particularly hard for students of color and Black students because of greater need, because of the existing racial wealth gap. We also know that Black students and other students of color have had a harder time paying off student loans over time. So our recent research I did with colleagues at Brandeis highlight the fact that about 1/4 of students over a period of 20 years defaulted. That's a major crisis, but about half, almost half, 49% of Black students in that same period defaulted. And so underfunding of higher education has been a major problem for students broadly, but has particularly hurt students of color and Black students in particular because of the racial wealth gap that we already see. So ongoing barriers in the pandemic, we know that families of color and have particularly faced devastating health consequences, but those economic consequences have been particularly dramatic as well. Black and Latino workers are less likely to be able to work from home. In addition to that, the limited rainy day fund, because of the existing racial wealth gap that Black and Latino families have, has led to families of color having less savings when they face income volatility or job loss during the crisis. So recent research and surveys from the Pew indicate that about 3/4 of families, Black and Latino families, report not having savings for 3 months during the pandemic, indicating that they really don't have the savings to address or mitigate a job loss. And then we've seen that unemployment rates throughout the pandemic are higher for Black employees. This has been true historically at every education level. Unemployment for Black workers is higher. So even as education levels go up, unemployment rate tends to go down, but because of ongoing discrimination in the job market, education does not mitigate all of the inequities we see in terms of unemployment. So repairing the harm at the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, we are working on a number of policies and policy proposals that we hope can address some of the issues that I've described. First, we are supporting a reparations task force here in the state of New Jersey, as well as the more national reparations movement here in the state of New Jersey. We hope that the bill will pass this year, which is currently been introduced in the state legislature to create a task force to provide policy proposals for reparations here in New Jersey. Other policies that we're working on specifically to close the racial wealth gap include baby bonds. We're supportive of both the federal and again, there's a state policy to create a state level baby bonds program. We're supportive of guaranteed income pilot programs, 2 of which have started recently in the state of New Jersey, in Newark and in Paterson. And you all may be aware that there's a national movement for guaranteed income in cities across the state through the Mirrors for Guaranteed Income. We're supporting the cancellation of student loan debt and greater expansion of tuition-free higher education. We, here in the state of New Jersey, there's a proposal for the Garden State Guarantee, which would expand tuition-free education for lower income students. And so we're supporting that initiative. And then expanding homeownership, as I identified. Homeownership is really crucial for wealth building. And so we think that addressing the racial disparities in homeownership is crucial for combating the racial wealth gap. Finally, I just wanted to highlight a little bit some of our democracy and justice work, because we feel that creating an inclusive democracy is really important for our ability to do many of these initiatives for economic justice and making sure that all voices are heard in our democracy. So our our democracy and justice team is working on early voting, same-day registration, and rights restoration for all. We recently had a success in helping restore rights, voting rights for folks who are on parole and probation, and we're working to continue that effort for folks who are currently incarcerated. So finally, here are just a few ways you can reach us. We hope you'll follow us online. And if you want to know more about all of our work broadly, from economic justice to our other pillars, please check out our 2021-2022 action agenda on our website. Thank you very much. And I look forward to questions.
Thank you so much. And as a reminder, if you've got questions, pop them into the Q&A box on the bottom. But for now, I want to turn our attention to Professor Hyatt to really dig in on this question of property and homeownership and the wealth disposition that has occurred over our country's history.
Great. Thank you so much, Lindsay. And I love that Laura came before me, which was intentional and perfect, because she really did set the table nicely for the conversation that I would like to start today in my opening remarks. So just to, pick up where Laura left off, or to highlight some points that were made, Blacks are loaned to less and at higher rates. Their valuation of the homes that they are able to attain is lower than their white counterparts, even in the same neighborhoods, even on the same blocks. You may have seen over the summer in the New York Times did nice features even in the same houses. So, right, like one Black family was, reported to have gotten a valuation, so an appraisal of their home, recognizing that valuation was not consistent with the neighborhood. They asked white friends to stand in for a second valuation. And so the same house in the same time frame and the same physical property, but with white folks in the home posing as the owners, resulted in a higher valuation. I mean, that's what we're dealing with, not in the past, but right now, right? And the Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law, details in terms of the redlining maps that Laura referred to, goes into detail in on the role that the government has played in securing this as the system that we're talking about here today. The Fair Housing Act, I spent almost a decade in the Civil Rights Division doing Fair Housing Act work, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which is part of the Civil Rights Act of 1968, is designed to combat many of the things I've just listed for us here today. But what we know is that limited enforcement and shape-shifting of the type of the manner in which discrimination shows up, right? That what the Fair Housing Act was designed to prevent in the 1960s is not necessarily the same, does not present in the same way now that the law has passed and more folks are aware of the law. So that lack of enforcement in the ways in which discrimination has shape-shifted has lowered the impact that we might have hoped to see in the Fair Housing Act. And so I think this is important backstory, but it's a more and more increasingly familiar story and narrative about like lack of access, that Black folks have a more difficult time getting into the wealth building, onto the wealth building playing field than their white counterparts. What is less familiar, and I'm glad we started out with noting and commemorating, naming the Tulsa and Greenwood neighborhood in Tulsa, which was known as Black Wall Street. What is less familiar of a story is the fact that Blacks have been able to, against all of these odds, gain wealth, and that even in those situations, they've been dispossessed of it through what I call a system of economic violence. And I think we need to have that conversation, right? Because the programs, and I want to use 3 case studies to demonstrate this point, but programs and all of the efforts that Laura speak of, those efforts are important and continue. But until we reckon with this history of systemic economic violence, that is when Blacks attain land, when Blacks attain wealth, that they are often systematically dispossessed of that wealth at the hands of both private and governmental actors. We can't hope to really address the caste system that is the wealth gap in America. And so I have just 3 cases to share with you and 3 slides to share with you to illustrate this point. And I hope that we'll walk away today with not thinking so much about Blacks needing to be fixed, right? That there's a lack of access, a lack of information, lack of opportunity, those things, a lack of discipline. Those things, again, in some cases are true. But there is, again, this history of discipline, of seeking out opportunity against all odds, of having the information and still being dispossessed of land. And we must reckon with that story. We must reckon with that part of the narrative if we are truly to erase the wealth gap. I'm going to try to share my screen. Give me 1 second. So we are all here for the same conversation, and thank you. I should have started out with thanking the American Constitution Society for having us here and engaging in this conversation. So the first, we've already heard about Tulsa and the case that really brought many of these facts to life about Tulsa. And here's a postcard, an actual live postcard that was taken and sent around the country from people who were in Tulsa at the time and wanted to have their friends and family members see and witness the burning of what they described as Little Africa, but that Black folks called Black Wall Street, to see and celebrate this burning of the land. And in Tulsa, there were 1,200 residences and 35 contiguous acres that were burned over this 24-hour period. Losses in 1921's account, by those dollars, were $1.8 million. In 1999, when much of this work was being started by Charles Ogletree and others, the valuation was upwards of $16 million of wealth lost in the Tulsa burning of the Greenwood neighborhood. There were no prosecutions, there were no convictions, no insurance payments, though people had insurance on their property, were paid out here. And the local legislature blocked rebuilding. I should have started with saying that against all odds, even at the start of the beginning of emancipation, Black people succeeded in acquiring a remarkable amount of land. By 1910, a mere 45 years post-emancipation, Black people claimed ownership to over 16 million acres of land in this country. They continued to acquire land and would be dispossessed of it. Between 1910 and 2007, Black farmers lost 80% of that land, largely due to discrimination and, again, economic violence. So we start with post-emancipation. I really should have started there. We move to the 1920s and this history of, Greenwood was not the only town that burned. There were other primarily Black neighborhoods that also were burned, also were destroyed, homes, families. There were businesses. The New York Times did an article this week that walked block by block, showing all the businesses, the restaurants, the movie theaters that were burned. In Greenwood and Tulsa was not an anomaly even at that time. So the second case I wanted to bring forward is Pickford 1 and 2. And these are the Black farm workers cases, kind of moving east and south. We see, and I was talking about these acres of land. How were the Black farmers dispossessed of their land? By their government, by the USDA, known as a Farm Services Agency at the time that we're talking about. This happened for decades. Black farmers lost significant amounts of land and farm income, importantly, as a result of discrimination by the Farm Services Agency. And what that looked like is that the way the Farm Services Agency works is that you can apply for land for planting and you return that money after your season has ended. Black farm workers did this consistently and identically to their white counterparts, but their loans were held up. They were denied. They were told to reapply. That paperwork was insufficient. They had to go through many, many hoops only to lose whole farming seasons and not be able to repay their debt or to support their families in the same way. This was not how the system was designed to work. And none of this is a figment of their imagination. There have been decades of study of this, right? Like you could think, oh, it's one person, two people, thousands of farm workers experienced this same discrimination and appeals. They were filing claims of discrimination. Those appeals were not heard timely, or they were denied, or they were reversed, even when they were heard timely and affirmed. In the end, Pickford 1 and 2 is much litigation. Almost seems that the litigation has lost it almost as long as the wrong and the harm. But I want to point out, the litigation remedies are very complicated, but there were two tracks you could go into, and many of the farmers were forced into the easier track. That track provided cash payments of $50,000 when people lost whole farms. They can't buy a farm back for $50,000 or equipment that was repossessed and loan forgiveness. My point here is that the Black wealth gap, when you take land but don't return land, when you take land or burn land but don't give people the money and the resources to get back, make themselves whole, this is not how the American legal system works, except as it relates to the dispossession of Black people's land. And we must confront this. There are some, specifics about both these cases that talk about the time it took for the litigants to come forward. But in Tulsa, they asked for reparations in real time. They were just denied, right? So we have to, our legal system is operating or suggesting it's operating as a neutral entity. Oh, it's too bad you didn't come timely. Black folks are coming timely, they're being denied, right? And these are the places where we must repair our system, not Black folks, not giving them more information. We must repair our system. So the last case study that I want to raise is something that some of us has even lived through, which is countrywide. And there were a number of banks that were sued when I was at the Department for Predatory Lending. We no matter the fact that we think of this as the foreclosure crisis, we should call it more predatory lending than I think we do, because many Americans don't realize that Black and brown people were similarly situated to borrowers at the time that they were put into these loans intentionally, that they were preyed on, that it wasn't that they didn't know how to apply for a loan or pay their bills, that they had good credit, they were sold a poor product, and then that product reacted as the people who sold it to them knew it would. It blew up in their face. This was intentional misconduct for which we bailed out the banks, but did not bail out the homeowners. And so I use countrywide as just one example. There was a $335 million settlement fund, right? Again, it's very similar to Pickford. The amounts that actual homeowners received was not enough to get their house back. Their homes weren't returned. The bank still owned those. They did not have enough money to buy a new home somewhere. Moreover, their credit was just blown up along with the real estate industry. But the settlement calls for some specific provisions that I just want to talk about, which is financial literacy, housing counseling for potential homeowners. Again, what we were talking about is a very specific targeted act against homeowners, people who had done nothing wrong, but we didn't repair them. We're talking about some future homeowner that if you know better, you won't do what? Go to a bank and apply for a loan that you should get on terms that are favorable to you. That's what people did wrong in the predatory lending crisis. And so I really I will stop there. There's Cory Booker and others, just shout out to New Jersey here. Kristen Gilderman, Elizabeth Warren are working on a Black Farm Workers Act that would do more to repair, to actually make folks whole. And so what we need is more speaking truth to power about the dispossession of Black wealth in this country, and legislative action that will really make the people whose land has been dispossessed, whole. And in their in the case of Tulsa, right, they're survivors. So thank you. I'll stop there. Thanks so much.
Oh, thank you so much. I want to shift gears a little bit and bring Professor Harpalani in to look at the education system, because as we know, oftentimes education and homeownership go quite hand in hand by design. And so would love to hear a little bit about education and equity and what can be done.
All right, let me go ahead and share my screen. Oops, I'm gonna be up here. All right, let's get this. First, I want to thank ACS not only for inviting me here to speak today, but for really inviting me to do a bunch of different things that have really augmented my career. Write an issue brief on affirmative action, do blog posts, and ACS is doing a lot of great work around the country, a lot of visibility. So I kind of just piggyback off of that. So I really appreciate the invitation. So Laura and Narendra kind of talked about housing, kind of talked about these kind of structural racism, structural aspects of how America's racial caste system has been maintained, and I think really important to have a grasp on that. I'm kind of shifting gears a little bit. I'm going to talk more about ideological racism. How is this racial hierarchy in America? How is it justified? What do we? How does our society kind of come to terms with this in terms of just maintaining white supremacy? So I'm going to kind of talk about the ideological dimension. As Lindsay said, I'm going to go into education a bit, but I'm really going to focus on affirmative action in higher education. That's the area that I write a lot about. But of course, the education system goes well beyond higher education and affirmative action. There's educational inequity throughout the system, through K through 12 education. And kind of coincidentally, Monday, May 31st is the anniversary of the Tulsa riot, but it's also another anniversary, kind of dubious anniversary. It is the anniversary of the second decision in Brown v. Board of Education. The first decision, the well-known one, where segregated public schools were declared unconstitutional, that was May 17th. But 1 year and 2 weeks later, on May 31st, 1955, the court ruled about the remedy in Brown 2. And, very unfortunately said that schools had to be desegregated, quote, with all deliberate speed. And that language was used to delay desegregation for many, many years. As I said, I'm going to talk about affirmative action. And ironically, again, this speaks to just our racial hierarchy composition of the courts. The Supreme Court seems to be, not taking any all deliberate speed, in a hurry to dismantle affirmative action. The Harvard case, I'm going to get into that a little bit. But the court has heard affirmative action cases quite frequently, over the past 25 years. I'm going to also focus on how people of color are divided against each other. And particularly the Harvard case that I'm going to talk about involves Asian American plaintiffs. So I'm going to start here with a little theoretical framework. I'm an academic, so I got to have the theoretical framework here. This idea of racial triangulation comes from Professor Claire Jean Kim. And this kind of gives us a framework to understand how Asian Americans are positioned within America's racial hierarchy in terms of just our racial ideology. So Professor Kim says, it's kind of complicated. It's maybe a little more complex than it may seem on its face. You have white Americans on top of the racial hierarchy, and you have Asian Americans kind of positioned in between white Americans and Black Americans. But there's a couple of different processes going on here. One, Asian Americans are what she calls relatively valorized with respect to Black Americans, basically exalted. And I'll get into that a little bit. I'll get into the model minority stereotype. And this is a means to dominate both groups. Asian Americans are doing better than Black Americans and must be something superior about them. But at the same time, Asian Americans are subject to what she calls civic ostracism, defined as foreigners, and marginalized in that way. Okay. I want to go into a little bit of history before I really get into affirmative action. This idea of Asian Americans as the model minority. Where does this come from in its modern iteration? And I'll start, the history of Asian immigration to this country goes back to the late 19th century, and then it was ended for a while, but then it reopened again. And this idea of the model minority really derives from the Cold War. After World War II, US and Soviet unions are the world's dominant powers. And in the late 50s and 1960s, the US needed more scientists and engineers to keep up with the Soviet Union. Soviet Union was the first into space with the Sputnik 1 satellite in 1957, had nuclear weapons. So there's kind of a panic in this country. We need more technology, we need more science. At the same time, China, India, Korea, other Asian countries had a lot of scientifically trained professionals, but they had limited economic opportunity in their own homelands. So the interests of these two groups converged. Professor Derek Bell talked about this notion of interest convergence with the Immigration Act of 1965, which contained occupational preferences for educated Asian immigrants. So immigration from Asian countries opened up. It had opened up a little bit before, but the Immigration Act of 1965 was key there. And this favored technically trained scientists, engineers, et cetera, from different Asian countries. So we look at this, we have these educated Asian American population after the Immigration Act of 1965. Does not apply to all Asian American groups. Some groups are more, have higher levels of education than others. US population as a whole, about 33% with bachelor's degrees. So you see some groups like Taiwanese, Asian, Indian Americans greatly exceed that. Others, Laotian, Cambodian, are much below that. But Asian Americans are often stereotyped as the model minority, as if all of them have this level of education and this level of resources. Now, the model minority stereotype, this idea that Asian Americans are high achievers, really took off after the Immigration Act of 1965, because you had children of these immigrants who are benefiting from their parents' educational and socioeconomic advantage, growing up in these educated home environments. Many of them became high academic achievers and were dubbed the model minority. And this idea of Asian Americans as the model minority is used to justify educational inequity, kind of create the ideology of why we have racial inequities in education. If Asian Americans can make it through hard work, why can't other people of color? And this, of course, ignores the very different histories of the Asian American population, voluntary immigrants, often educated immigrants, and say Black Americans, very different history, denied opportunity going back to slavery. But this model minority is part of the ideological dimension of racism that justifies inequality. So how does all of this relate to affirmative action? We can start in the early 1980s when you had large numbers of Asian Americans who began enrolling at elite universities, again, children of the first wave of immigrants, or the wave of post-1965 educated wave of immigrants, begin enrolling in large numbers. And this leads to resentment among white students on these campuses. So we had the relative valorization through the model minority, but also kind of a civic ostracism here. You had epithets levied at these campuses, MIT called Made in Taiwan, UCLA, University of Caucasians, Lost Among Asians. So there's this resentment that, you have all these Asian American students on these campuses. This led to certain allegations of discrimination against Asian Americans, discrimination not only by these students, but also by the universities themselves. They didn't want their campuses to look too quote unquote Asian, too quote unquote foreign. Some of their alumni might not be happy about this. So there were allegations of discrimination against Asian Americans at this time, even though Asian Americans are becoming well represented. Investigations by the US Department of Education. There was a study by Princeton that showed Asian Americans academically tend to be better than the average student, but in the admissions process are rated as not as strong as white applicants. And this kind of reflects the stereotype of Asian Americans as one-dimensional nerds and geeks, good at math and science, but socially inept, lacking in leadership skills. So we had these allegations in the 1980s. We had investigations. Not much really came of that, but it did set the stage for the current affirmative action lawsuit. And I want to kind of distinguish between two terms here, very important distinction. Affirmative action refers to policies, practices such as race-conscious university admissions that benefit underrepresented applicants in university admissions. Negative action are policies or practices which disadvantage Asian American applicants in comparison to white applicants. And in the current Harvard lawsuit, these ideas, these terms have been conflated and kind of mixed together. The Harvard lawsuit kind of uses negative action, links it to affirmative action as a challenge to affirmative action. I won't go into the doctrine around race-conscious admissions that much. That's not really the point of this presentation, although we could talk about that in Q&A if people want to, but I'll just talk about the Harvard lawsuit a little bit in broader terms. It's brought by an ironically named organization, Students for Fair Admissions, and basically contends that Harvard discriminates against Asian Americans in favor of both applicants of color and white applicants. And that's the really insidious part of this. It's a broad challenge to race-conscious admissions, affirmative action, but uses negative action as a hook. It's not disputed that on average, admitted Asian American applicants have higher grades and test scores than any other group. So why might this be? Well, there's several possible neutral explanations. Asian Americans are underrepresented in legacy admissions, which is a whole nother conversation in itself, and athletic scholarships. Overrepresented in science and engineering majors, which may require higher test scores, grades for admission. Also geographic differences. Asian American applicants are more concentrated on the coasts, and universities like Harvard sometimes like to look for geographic diversity also. Take applicants from places like North Dakota, South Dakota, places where there are not that many students at Harvard from. So number of different neutral explanations. But what came out of this Harvard lawsuit, a lot of different things came out. What the lawsuit found was that Asian American applicants were rated higher than white applicants on academic criteria and extracurricular activities, except for athletics, but rated lower on Harvard's quote unquote personal rating score, which assesses applicants' character traits, whether they have positive personality, humor, leadership ability, all of these kind of interpersonal skills. Same qualities where Asian Americans are stereotyped as lacking and inferior to white Americans. So at the district court, Harvard prevailed. There was no question that Harvard's admissions plan conformed to the Bakke-Grutter-Fisher standard for race-conscious admissions. But the district court judge also noted that the disparity between white and Asian American applicants' personal ratings has not been fully and satisfactorily explained. So kind of hinting that maybe this stereotype of Asian Americans as passive, socially inept does play into the Harvard admissions process. And SFFA has really jumped on that because this case is not just about a doctrinal challenge to affirmative action, although of course that's what the Supreme Court could take up. It's also more broadly a public relations effort to divide people of color, divide Asian Americans and other people of color. The judge in the case, Judge Burroughs, she posited that implicit bias could be taking place here, possibly by Harvard's admissions reviewers, but more likely by teachers and counselors' recommendations. The teachers and counselors maybe just don't see Asian Americans as personable or having the same leadership qualities. Other other explanations here for the differences in personal rating scores. Asian American applicants tend to go to larger schools with higher teacher-counselor ratios, so that may lead to more just perfunctory recommendations. The teachers, counselors don't get to know students as well. And the First Circuit on appeal suggested this may be an explanation. First Circuit upheld the district court, ruled for Harvard. There could also be implicit bias going on here. Asian Americans are in fact being stereotyped as socially inept. That's not legally actionable, but still cause for concern and can lead to this division among people of color. First Circuit ruled for Harvard. SFFA filed a petition, a cert petition to the Supreme Court, and this is coming up soon. Justices will discuss the cert petition at their June 10th conference. So we'll likely know on June 13th whether there was a grant or denial of cert. Not for sure, they could defer a decision, but it quite possibly we'll know in the next few weeks. If cert is granted, if the US Supreme Court does hear this case, most experts think affirmative action will be struck down, given the current composition of the court. Now, what are some of the broader implications of this? Well, implications for admissions, use of standardized tests is a big barrier to the admission of underrepresented people of color, and that's being called into question also. We may need more representative admissions plans if affirmative action is struck down. But what I'm kind of focused on here is the potential long-term divisive effect among different groups of people of color. Just issues like this pitting different groups of people of color against each other. And I think affirmative action, Asian Americans are well represented at elite universities and already, but affirmative action has maybe a minimal effect on that representation. But you have other controversies coming up in education. The controversy over the specialized high school admissions test in New York City, which could lead to a much greater divide among Asian Americans and other people of color, because Asian Americans are admitted in high numbers to the specialized high schools in New York City. New lawsuit in Fairfax County, Virginia, Thomas Jefferson High School for Science and Technology, which also involves Asian American plaintiffs. So this is not just about affirmative action. It's many different issues, and particularly within the realm of education. Now, in spite of all this, most groups, Asian Americans generally in national polling tend to favor affirmative action. Some groups more so than others, but this is, I think, a fragile issue. And there are other issues, other lawsuits, other public relations efforts, quote unquote public relations efforts by organizations, conservative organizations like SFFA. This could lead to a greater division among people of color. So what do we do about this? And I just posit some initial ideas here. Separate affirmative action from negative action. To the extent that Asian Americans are being stereotyped in admissions, it's something to address, but that's completely separate from affirmative action. We have to reject the model minority and other stereotypes and just recognize structural racism, barriers that different groups face. And Laura and Narinda really went into that beyond education, many different barriers, and recognize how racial stereotypes contribute to racial inequality, lead to these divide and conquer tactics. I think, that's one common ground here that we see between Asian Americans and say Black Americans is racial stereotyping. No one likes to be stereotyped. And the stereotypes of African Americans are, more harmful in many ways, but it's still how the groups are pitted against each other. We need to identify our common interest in combating racial stereotypes. And we also have to recognize how advances by one group promote advances by other groups. The Immigration Act of 1965, no coincidence that it came on the heels of the Civil Rights Movement. Opening up immigration to people from Asian countries was part of the Civil Rights Movement. And everything that happened before, the Montgomery bus boycott, March on Washington, led to that. More currently, the COVID-19 related violence against Asian Americans, there's been a lot of attention to that, a lot of mobilization, the Stop AAPI Hate movement. I think that has built on the Black Lives Matter movement. Black Lives Matter brought a lot of attention to police brutality against Black Americans. And in that climate that Black Lives Matter created, that's when we were able to address what was going on with Asian Americans. If Black Lives Matter was not there to open up the discussion about racial discrimination, racialized violence, I don't think Stop AAPI would have been as successful in gaining attention. And lately, last few months, particularly since the Atlanta incident, there's been a lot of attention to violence against Asian Americans, more than ever before. So we should recognize that came on the heels of Black Lives Matter, and addressing oppression of one group allows the greater addressing of the oppression of other groups. So I will conclude right there. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a few minutes, so I want to get to at least 2 questions. So I apologize for giving kind of short periods of time to answer them. But the first, I'm going to go ahead and direct to Dr. Sullivan, but others feel free to jump in. We've seen an erosion of labor rights over the last 50 years and a persistent wage gap. Labor leaders are calling for passage of the PRO Act to rebalance the scales. How does decreased worker power and lack of access to quality jobs contribute to the wealth gap, and what can be done to fix it?
Thank you, Lindsay, for that question. I think, it's an important one because income and wealth are intertwined, right? So I talked earlier about how wealth gaps are actually higher than income gaps, but it's really important for us to understand the intersection of those because both are crucial for economic security. So I think we have seen a loss of worker power broadly over the last several decades, and we've seen a declining real wages for lower skilled workers and middle skilled workers. And so we definitely think that greater access to quality jobs is really important and one of the factors that can contribute to closing the racial wealth gap. I think when we think about quality jobs and how we can improve the lives of workers, we need to think broadly about the whole job, right? So benefits are really crucial, and we see major disparities by race and ethnicity in terms of benefits. So whether it's healthcare, which is really important for preventing economic shocks from medical events, to retirement benefits, there's major disparities there that then contribute to the racial wealth gap. So it's really important that we increase access to quality jobs, and certainly increasing worker power is part of that. And I look forward to working more at the Institute as we think through ways to help expand access to quality jobs and grow wealth among workers of color in particular. In past work we've done, we've worked around on expanding access to apprenticeships and making sure that apprenticeships are truly diverse. And that's one area that we think is important for helping expand access to good paying with benefits, middle skilled jobs.
Excellent, thank you. In the interest of time, I'm going to jump to the next one. What priorities or practices do you think law schools should adopt to make sure that new lawyers are aware of the racial wealth gap, including the law's role in creating and maintaining these material realities? So I'm going to ask either professor to jump in, since this might be more in your wheelhouse.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in here briefly to say many law schools, including my own, which is Rutgers in Newark, have initiated in the wake of George Floyd's murder an audit of their own curriculums. We are engaged in anti-racism and equity audit at the law school, which seeks to make sure, one, that we have enough course offerings, including mandatory, potential mandatory 1L requirement that would add a course early in your law school career that seeks to undo some of this narrative that we've been talking about. Like, law is neutral, law is not creating and upholding and creating the scaffolding and upholding systemic racism. So we're doing that, but also how we admit, right? There's lots of conversations nationwide about how we are admitting students into higher education, what our streams of and sources of financial aid look like, also our part in financial support, to Laura's point, like that we can give more money free of repayment necessity that we could provide as much money for free as possible so that first generation, in particular students of color, are not saddled with an extreme amount of debt. So these types of audits are not just curricular, but are top to bottom in recognizing that law schools themselves have been perpetuated systems of oppression, and we must interrogate our own role in creating and maintaining the system. So that's what we're doing, and I know many others are as well.
Thank you so much. I want to thank all of our panelists. This has been a fantastic conversation and one that we look forward to continuing here at ACS, and we really appreciate you taking the time. I also want to remind everybody who's watching, we have our national convention coming up. It begins June 7th and goes that whole week. We're going to start with a conversation about what a third Reconstruction would look like. So if this conversation was interesting, please tune in for that one. And for the rest of our programming as well, which will really dig deep on some of these issues. So thank you again. I hope everybody has a safe and happy holiday weekend, and we look forward to seeing everybody soon. Take care.